Hello, everyone. It's Davidson here. I just wanted to come with a bit of an update and read some from the book. That way, for those of you who are interested in the sample, but maybe you're hesitant to sign up for the newsletter or just prefer maybe an audiobook style experience of stories rather than reading it, I'll be able to do that for you. Also had some feedback on Facebook and got me thinking about maybe explaining a bit more about my kind of description of the book, especially I think when authors describe something as, for fans of, or if you like this book, you will like this other one. So why describe my book as kind of a blend of Lord of the Rings, Chronicles of Narnia, The Dark Tower, with a lot of Lovecraft inspiration and foundation? Well, first of all, I suppose for many readers, it is helpful to have some point of reference to gauge whether they would be remotely interested in a book, though providing these other points of reference run certain risk. For one, making it sound like this story doesn't know what it wants to be, or that I constructed it piecemeal using these others. And so to that, first, I'd make 2 points. First being that I'm a pantser. So for those of you unfamiliar with that term, what I mean is I don't historically outline things, plan them out in advance, look at whether I'm running like a 3 or 5 act story, how am I going to break this down, etc., and filling in plot details, characters, character arcs, and kind of craft it from the foundation up. Literally, this whole book began with this question of what is a Gray Paladin? And I was wondering that one day driving into work. And I guess within that, I thought, well, paladins are typically thought of as objectively good, even symbolic of light. And a Gray Paladin doesn't seem like they would be that. But they wouldn't be dark either. But perhaps that's a bit closer. So it's like the paladin has lost their way, something bad has happened. And what was this? Surely it must have been something pretty awful. And where does the paladin go from that point? Have they fallen too far? And is redemption possible? So when I began this book, I didn't know so many things about it, which I suppose is the case for most stories, right? For most authors. I didn't know that I would have such strong female characters when I began writing this book. I didn't know some of the awesome moments Breanor was going to have. I didn't know just how horrible certain moments would be. I didn't know that Arion, a horse, was going to exist and play the roles he did. And I didn't know there would actually be moments that would make me cry in reading my own story. So the second point is that only when I began contemplating how to market and grow an audience did I start wondering what books mine was similar to. And these were the closest when viewing the various aspects of this novel. So back to the points of reference. In short, I say Lord of the Rings because we see something of what hope, innocence, and friendship can accomplish against evil. Chronicles of Narnia because the struggle of good versus evil, religious themes, though I don't employ allegory, and I've constructed a fictitious religion with Lovecraft inspiration. And there are creatures other than man with intelligence and the capacity to exercise faith. The Dark Tower because there's a very small group of characters who make this journey to confront an ever-present villain who's also absent. Until you get to that climactic confrontation where you were expecting something very bad to happen, but you just weren't sure what exactly that was going to be. I say Lovecraft because there are real horrors inhabiting this known world, but there are still greater unknown ones with unfathomable desires, so markedly different from man, and Lovecraft mythos and ideas are borrowed from and used as a framework and foundation for the overarching evil within this world, this universe I've created. So This world is confronted by an unbelievable darkness, despair, and dread, and light is struggling to win. Survival is not to be taken for granted. So, that being said, what I'll do now is I'll read the blurb, and then I'll just jump in. I'll read the sample that I provided on my newsletter for those of you who are interested in listening to it. So the blurb reads on the back of this proof copy here: The Paladin Order once protected mankind. Half a century ago, Ildradath, the adjurer of the Order, led a crusade into the abyss to destroy a powerful artifact needed to awaken the Dread One. Now the lone survivor of that crusade wastes away in a tower, in grief-stricken isolation and wounded faith. When Lilium's family caravan is attacked by a creature of the abyss while fleeing to the western heights, she finds herself alone, cowering, and praying to be rescued by the very man who believes his own prayers go unanswered. The Old Ones and their cultists are busy fulfilling the Dread One's schemes, and they will not stop until the world is under his control and madness and ruin consume everything. The beneficent divines, with unseen hands at work, know a quest to confront these horrors must be undertaken, and that the fate of mankind will depend on a miracle. Can those who have lost everything find reason to hope? Can faith be enough against the machinations of the dark powers, or will the tides of the abyss forever spill into the world? So that's the blurb from the book. And we will jump into chapter 1. So there's 10 chapters within this book, varying lengths. They're broken up into parts to make it a little more manageable. If you're like me, once in a while, I just like to read enough to get to a part and stop. So I've done that for convenience sake and for thematic reasons as well. So, chapter 1, An Outstretched Hand. It came to pass that the Old Ones betrayed the celestial treaty, and the abyss trespassed upon the world. Man was driven to madness and despair, except for the first man to pray to the divines for help. They answered and sent him courage, so he became the first paladin. To this day, there has always been a paladin to seek the will of the divines and bolster the will of man. Part 1. His cloaked figure darkened the doorway of the windmill's ruins. 3 windmill blades, partially burnt and wholly forgotten, lay where they had fallen over 30 years ago. The 4th still hung, pointing toward the ground, like an omen and guide for the living, for those in Esramore are said to be destined for the dirt. The windmill's stonework was charred in places, and moss grew in others, and the inside was a maze filled in by the upper portions that had collapsed on that fateful day. The rain poured, making the ground muddier by the moment, and its muck ascended skyward against the low-hanging, deep dark clouds pouring out their wet wrath. The morning sun shone somewhere, but not upon these blighted lands. A damp chill permeated everything like death's touch, and in the center of the town below, last night's blood was being washed away. She had been huddled against a broken beam and pile of stones, too afraid to move, shivering, crying, and praying all night in this unfamiliar, dangerous land. Her family's small caravan had been attacked by a lone fiend the night before as they passed through the abandoned town of Haverstead in Esramore. She was sure she was the sole survivor, and she was sure that the fiend still wandered nearby. He extended his hand, and she took it without hesitation. "We must move quickly, child. Do not speak, and do not leave my side. Understand?" His voice was demanding but mellow. She nodded, and they moved out from the windmill. Rather than descend the hill to the town where her family and horses lay slaughtered, they moved straight toward the closest stand of trees, which formed a more extensive, sparse wood line on the town's northern edge. Their feet pattering among the puddles was the only sound that filled her world. Each step threatened to summon the fiend. The man, with eyes darting to and fro, led her through the thin stand of trees and eventually to the far side of the town, and they continued for a while, before arriving at a lone stone tower in a clearing. Scanning around, before daring to move further into the open, The man quietly studied their surroundings. Whether the man's eyes tracked unseen dangers or fearful hesitation gripped him, she could not tell. Neither could she tell how long they had walked. It was a blur. However long it was, they waited equally as long before moving into the open. The rain intensified, obscuring their surroundings behind its torrential wall. He tugged her hand and began running toward the tower. The tower itself was not impressive, at least not as towers are often thought to be. It was several stories tall, but had relatively simple stonework, and the roof tiles looked decrepit. Neither torches nor candles illuminated its door or windows, but it offered sanctuary. A single large iron-reinforced wooden door stood as the portal to the tower's promise of safety. The man placed a hand on the door and muttered quickly before throwing it open and pushing her inside. He slammed it closed and breathed a sigh of relief. She stood still while looking up at him. She had no idea where she was, and her family was gone. Nevertheless, a sliver of hope remained despite the grim events. She had been rescued, after all. He looked into her eyes with his hooded cloak still drawn tight. His eyes focused upon hers, but he soon leaned back and looked away. He brought a hand to his mouth and took a quick, raspy breath, followed by a slow sigh. Like a ghost from his past, something in that young girl's face demanded more of him. He lifted the hood from his head and removed his cloak, hanging it on a nearby hook. The room was dark, but this would soon be remedied. He walked over, stoked the embers in the fireplace, and threw some twigs and a small log inside. "Come, sit near the fire, little one. You must be chilled." He motioned to a small wooden stool near the hearth as he sat in a wooden chair. His voice was inviting, and she quickly did as he suggested. She walked over, sat, and wrapped her arms tightly around herself. The sound of crackling wood, the fire's warmth, and its light began filling the room, but disquietude accompanied the comfort of the fire. She mainly sat still, aside from occasionally rubbing her hands together and fighting off the shivers. She regularly took a deep breath, followed by several small ones, to suppress crying in front of the stranger. The screams and sounds of the night before repeatedly played in her mind. She stared into the fire and shuddered, but when it seemed safe to steal a look at the man's face, she did so. The man's hair was more gray than black, and his face was covered in stubble. He had tired but kind eyes set in a worn countenance. His lips were chapped, his hands looked capable, and his frame hinted at a constitution now gone. After some time, she became bothered by the silence and felt compelled to say something. She desperately wanted to be distracted from her thoughts. "Thank you for coming," she whispered, afraid to break the silence with words too loud. "Yes." He nodded while staring into the flames. "I wasn't sure you would, but I prayed all night, and you did," she added. His eyes cut over to her with a snap. He rubbed his chin with a hand and shook his head. "Prayed all night?" he asked. "What exactly did you pray for?" "That the Gray Paladin of Ezramor would come save me," she replied. "I'm afraid the Paladins are gone," he replied matter-of-factly. "No," she responded with furrowed eyebrows. "It is known that the Gray Paladin still lives in Ezramor. I prayed for him to come save me, and you came. You are the Gray Paladin of Ezramor." "Child, do I look like a paladin to you?" She shivered. "I don't know. I have never met one. I have heard stories, though." "That's because they are nothing more than stories now. Do I look like what they say?" he asked. "I have heard they shine in or out of armor. Their presence inspires faith, hope, and love. A person need not be afraid when a paladin is nearby, and I am not so afraid now." Though weak and weary, the girl spoke with a precious certitude. The man took several deep breaths while shaking his head and staring into the fire. He then brought his eyes to lock onto hers. I am glad that you are not so afraid. I don't think you understand what others mean when speaking of the Gray Paladin. The name is an insult. Paladins are said to be pure and devoted, in stark contrast to the mire of this world. They stand out from it and radiate like you suggested. Do I seem anything of that sort? She studied his features and their surroundings more. The inside of the tower had little to look upon. There was nothing ornate or decorative. It was austere, and had the fire not been going, everything and everyone would have looked like muted extensions of their surroundings. Even her fair skin melded into the room and blended into his dark skin. I think everything, including you, looks a bit gray. Seems fitting for the Gray Paladin, and I don't say that to give offense, and I prayed, and you came. Paladins are champions of the faithful who— You don't know what paladins are, he interjected. He jabbed at the fire with a snap of his arm and tossed a dry peat brick inside. Then who are they? She shot back with a faltering voice. He shook his head in exasperation. There are those who fight with flesh and blood. He paused. Then there are the paladins. He opened his mouth as if to add more, stopped and shook his head again. Maybe next time you should pray for safe travels, girl. Me coming was nothing but a coincidence. I wanted to take a walk is all. She stared at the fire, hurt by his remark. Her family had prayed for safe travels. Each day they set out, they prayed together. She reasoned that this was not a failure of the prayers. Sometimes bad things happen for reasons. Maybe my prayer led you to wanting to go for a walk. Maybe that is why— I doubt that is why I wanted to go out for a bit of a walk. I really doubt it, he stammered with a grimace. Why else would you go walking in such awful weather? She quickly reasoned back. He opened his mouth, raised a finger as he was prepared to make another sharp remark, and then said nothing. He looked back into the fire and stirred the embers. He tossed in another brick of peat. Doesn't mean I'm the Gray Paladin. It doesn't. It just means I wanted to walk, and when I discovered what had happened, I felt obligated to help. She pulled her folded arms tighter to her body and looked away from him. Despite what he was saying, she was confident in what she believed. How did you know I was in the windmill? She asked. I checked to see if anyone had survived the attack. I saw your shoe prints leading between buildings and up the hill to it. She looked at the fire, bit her lip, shuddered, and bent over her arms. She began rocking back and forth. Did you see it? See what? He asked. That thing that attacked us, she asked. The fiend, no. I think it is still nearby. We are safe here, though. A noticeable shiver shook her body with a slight jump. It was awful. It looked like a person, but hunched over, on all fours. Long hair on its head and claws on its hands and feet, so many sharp teeth, rows of them, and I think it laughed. She could not finish her sentence as she began to sob. Shh, child, you are safe now, you're safe. He leaned forward and brought the palm of his hand to rest against his forehead. Her youthful face was ensconced by long dark chestnut hair. If she was older than 11, it was not by much. She was beautiful. She was innocent. She was sharp. If her fate had befallen anyone, it would not be fair. But it did happen to her. All its horror, purpose, and calamity had heaped itself upon her. He cleared his throat and made an effort to speak kindly. It was a pox fiend, a grotesque aberration of the abyss. Given the tracks I found in your description, I'm sure of it. Did it ever touch you? She shook her head. Good. He paused and took a deep breath. Their flesh developed sores and wounds, which fester orange-looking, pox-carrying pustules. If you catch the pox contagion, no one will be able to cure you. Apothecaries will not even so much as touch you. That contagion will always spread with contact, and that foul disease is alive. It can wait weeks or months for the opportune time to reveal itself. Why would it attack us? She asked. She stared into the fire and soon found the aromas of the burning peat pleasant. Well, the fiend, or Any Abyssian, for that matter, does not need reasons. He looked back into the fire and shifted in his chair. He stirred the embers once more. "Did you see another man out there?" she asked. "Another man?" He frowned briefly and shook his head. "I'm sure I saw another man at some point. Was a local man killed in the attack too?" "I doubt it. The town has been abandoned for many years, 30 or more. Too dangerous. No one lives in these parts for fear of such things. If there was another man, he is likely dead along with everyone else." She nodded slowly. "And what about my family? They need to be buried." "Your family will have to wait. It is not safe now, and you need rest." He looked into her eyes for a moment before continuing. "We can consider that tomorrow. I have a bit of venison left, which I will warm, along with a few vegetables." She nodded. He handed her a water bladder and went upstairs to prepare their food. The rest of the day was spent without exchanging many words. The girl would often doze off and wake with a startle. She was hesitant to truly lay down and rest despite her fatigue. She was emotionally drained, and her waking moments passed that day in a stupor. As the evening dragged on, she had repeated moments of disbelief. Perhaps what happened last night did not happen. This is just a bad dream, she thought. The man made a very simple pallet for her by laying a deerskin on the floor, and he gave her a small wool blanket. It was more than sufficient to keep her warm near the fire. After checking to ensure the door was secured, the man bluntly reassured her that he would be upstairs. She nodded and lay on the pallet. While staring into the fire, she eventually lost her fight against sleep, but she never slept deeply. Part 2. The morning came with a languishing silence. The man set about, mostly brooding or finding things to keep himself busy. He most preferred to whittle a piece of wood near the hearth idly, and once he had amassed a small pile of shavings, he would toss them inside. Occasionally, he would toss a small chunk of dry peat inside, and its aromatic, earthy smokiness would fill the air anew. The girl brought up her family's burial more than once, and he reassured her he knew. She eventually understood that he had no interest in doing what she wanted, but she was not in a position to press the issue. She did not know what her future held, but she, at least for the moment, preferred the uncertainty over what might happen if she attempted to bury her family by herself, and she had to be honest with herself. She could not do that alone anyway. She had espied every feature in the lowest room of the tower. She had heard stories of the Paladin's towers. While she imagined such a place in her dreams as wonderfully decorated inside, she was disappointed with its reality. Nevertheless, she was optimistic that it held secrets. She wanted to venture beyond the lowest room and its 2 closets, one of which was the latrine. As she wondered about the tower, and she also realized that she did not know the man's actual name. She was still confident that he was the Gray Paladin of Esrimor, and that was name enough for her, but she knew he would not accept her referring to him as such. She looked over at him as he sat in his chair whittling, and she decided to introduce herself formally. "By the way, sir, my name is Lilium. I am pleased to make your acquaintance." His dagger stopped mid-whittle, leaving a long, thin strand of wood hanging. He turned, but his eyes stared beyond her. I am Braenor, yes. I apologize for not introducing myself earlier, and I am pleased to make your acquaintance as well, though I wish it had been under better circumstances." She nodded and smiled politely back. "May I take a walk, maybe just upstairs to stretch my legs?" she asked. He looked at his hands and then nodded. "I suppose you have been cooped up, and it could be nice to do so. I'll tell you what, I will show you around a bit on the condition you don't ask about tending to your family again today." Lilium bit her lip. "Okay," she muttered while trying hard to hide her disappointment. "Ever been in a tower like this?" Braenor asked, with genuine curiosity in his voice. "No," she softly smiled, "but my father was on the city council in Monroebane. I lived in the keep before we fled, but that old place was boring." Her curiosity was greater than she realized, and she felt a delightful rush of excitement. "Oh, you lived in the keep. Were you tutored?" he asked. "Yes, daily," she smiled politely. At the time, she didn't care about her parents' insistence on education. There were games to play and dreams to dream. Additionally, her lessons had always felt easy, and she knew her time could be better spent elsewhere. Now, she wished more than anything to spend hours bored to death under the expensive tutelage that once plagued her life. "It shows. It is good to be educated in a world of fools," he said bluntly. "Well, I bet you hadn't seen a place like this, even if you had lived in the keep. And nowhere has this tower beat. Nowhere," he declared while lifting his hands to gesture around. He placed the piece of wood and dagger on the hearth and motioned her to follow him. Lilium thought she saw a smile cross his face, and she was glad to see that Brainor could be something other than grumpy. She noticed that the dagger looked unlike any she had ever seen. Not that she had seen many. Still, it looked bright and had a swirl pattern on the blade. They ascended the spiral stone staircase to the next floor. The tower was constructed so the staircase wrapped each subsequent floor, and a single door on their left would lead into a single room. 2 people might fit side by side on the stairs, or, in Lilium's mind, 1 paladin in armor. Braynor opened the second floor's door, and they stepped inside. It was a kitchen. There was a fire pit with roasting pans, pots, and a large skewer that could be rotated. There was a metal rack across the top for the pans. A table against the wall had knives and spoons of all shapes and sizes. A tall shelf had another handful of vegetables, but was otherwise barren. No other food was in sight. Lilium walked over to another door within the room and opened it. She observed a small pantry with empty shelves. She closed the door back and looked at Braynor with expectation, signaling she was content to move along. Her eyes scanned the room again as she exited. They went up to the next floor. "This is the library," he spoke with a tone hinting at disappointment. There were 4 simple wooden chairs along the room's perimeter facing inward, each accompanied by a small stand that held a candle and bookrest. There were no shelves, and the ceiling appeared higher than she would have guessed before entering the room. A large, round candelabra hung from the center of the ceiling. Its lit candles burnt gently, but no wax dripped. Up against the farthest wall from the door, a dark blue velvet curtain with faded gold embroidery hung forlornly over yet another fireplace. She walked up and pushed the curtain aside, expecting to see a tower window. Instead, she saw a dark, empty cavity about an arm's length in depth. There were no books in sight, which was very different from what she expected from a library. "What's this for?" she inquired. Braynor stood staring at a section of wall between 2 chairs, and he did not acknowledge her. His hands were brought to his mouth, and his fingers covered his lips. His mouth was moving, but she could not hear him saying anything. "Braynor?" she asked. He coughed to clear his throat. He turned towards her, realizing he had missed something. "What's this for?" she asked again. "Well, books," he replied. He spoke as though it should have been apparent. "Seems odd to put them behind curtains." "And where are all the books?" She walked over to the only interior door and opened it, but this, too, similar to the kitchens below, only opened to reveal a small empty closet. "Yes, the books." He lifted a hand toward the curtained alcove and hesitated with it outstretched. He then let it drop back to his side. "Well, seems I have none presently." "I see that, but I guess what I'm really asking is how can you call this a library? A library without books? It can't really be called a library, can it? And why 4 chairs and stands if only you live here?" He bit his tongue and cut his eyes away from her while grimacing. "Maybe more people used to come to this tower. Maybe it once had books. Maybe we should be done with this little tour then." No, I'm sorry. It's nice and all. It's just not what I think of when I think of a library. Didn't mean anything by it." She turned while looking over the room to ensure she had not missed something. Right, well, shall we? Again, he motioned out the door and upward. The next room, the fourth floor, contained racks for weapons and armor as well as 2 large locked chests. A stone forge, anvil, whetstone wheel, and other implements occupied about half the room. A larger window with a wooden shutter was right over the forge. Spotting another door on this floor, she walked over and opened it. To her disappointment, it was yet again another empty closet. This is the last floor, as you can plainly see. I know it isn't much without weapons, armor, and such. Obviously, in a bit of disuse. Braynor was disinterested in the room, and Lilium could see that he was becoming bothered by something. As Lilium spoke, she made a concerted effort to sound impressed. Yes, but it is nice. I can imagine the hard work and the heat from the forge. This was the center of much grand toil before your adventures, I imagine. Her eyes were wide as thoughts of what might have happened in that room flew about her mind. If you say so, he replied bluntly. Tour's over, let's head back down. What's that ladder go to? She inquired while pointing up to the hatch in the ceiling above, a wooden ladder against the wall. It's access to the roof for repairs. Come along now. He motioned. They went back to the first floor. As she re-entered that room, she felt its coziness. Perhaps it was merely its strange familiarity. She had not been in the tower for more than 1 day, and most of it was spent in that room. It had become familiar, and it was cozy. As she stepped across the room, she felt a creak in the floor beneath the rug in the center. She had not noticed this before. She knelt and began to lift the corner of the rug. As she began to pull it back, one of Braynor's feet emerged into view and onto the rug. What do you think you're doing? He boomed. His tone was harsh and unapologetic. His furrowed eyes revealed that he was not asking a question, but was making a point that what she was doing was unacceptable. I just thought I heard the creaking of wood, and the floor is made of stone, and what? Just gonna have a look. Just do what you want inside my home, then. No consideration of whether you should ask first. His eyes pierced Lilium's, and she was quick to look away. She stood without a word and returned to the stool where she had been accustomed to staying. Her world had gotten a little bigger for a much-needed moment, and now she was back to reality. She was in her corner of the world again, a place without the loving help of family and enveloped by the irritable trappings of the man who saved her. The day finished much like the evening before. She ate a little and then once again fought sleep. She was not as dreadfully tired, and her mind felt more relaxed. Perhaps because Braynor did not want her snooping under the rug, he made himself a pallet downstairs for the evening. Chapter 2. Caught in the Gray. And the light dawned upon the face of man, and there was no sickness or death for a time. The Godhead made themselves known unto man as the divines, and so they communed by faith. But the Dread One set his face against mankind, and the age of peace gave way to one of sorrow, despair, and horror. Mankind cried out, and the divines heard and took pity upon them. Part 1. The sun was not far from lifting its eyes over the horizon and gracing the rest of the world with its light when Lilium struggled in her sleep. Words, some half-spoken and others stammering out whole, rose from her palate. Mother, Father, no. She was seeing it all over again. Her mind had been trying to sort it all out since she had been in the tower. It was now coming back to her, all too vividly. The unknown man stood in their path, obscured in darkness and just beyond the reach of their torches and lanterns. Traveling at night was unsafe, but her family had hoped to make good time and reach the western heights. Most of all, they did not want to spend another moment in Nezra. As her father called out to the man, a shadow moved to the right, and the man was gone when they looked back. The fiend launched itself upon them. The stable-keeper's throat was ripped out, spewing blood upon her mother before anyone could make sense of what was happening. Her mother was pulled off the wagon and dragged out of the torchlight and into the darkness, screaming. By the time her father was off the wagon with his sword, the creature was upon him. It had knocked him down and was over him, trying its hardest to bite his face. Her father tried to push it off and struggled, twisting, turning, and cursing in vain before shouting, "Run, get help!" The horses reared, squealed, and jerked at the wagon while her eyes remained fixed upon that fiend in all its horror. She was dazed, unable to look away until her cousin pushed her off the wagon and shouted, "Go!" She ran until she found the windmill, not looking back despite the screams and haunting cackling that filled the air. Again and again this played in her dream. Again and again she sought a different ending. Again and again to no avail. Again and again and again. "Girl, wake up now, wake!" Braynor yelled. Startled, disoriented, and with wet eyes, clammy hands, and profuse sweating, she found herself leaned up from her pallet and cradled in his arms. She looked upward in confusion between the dream world and haunting reality. "Shh, it was a dream. It was a dream. You're safe now," he reassured her. "It was real. It really happened. Everyone is gone. I am alone," she began sobbing. He held her but said nothing more. Some words may mend the broken, but even the right words spoken at the wrong time can wound. Braynor remained there, holding her gently as she cried back to sleep. Part 2. Later that morning, after she had eaten breakfast, Braynor let Lilium know that it had stopped raining for once. In those days, it always rained. She was pleased to know he was intending to give her family a proper burial. She expressed her intent to accompany him, but he was unwilling for her to undertake such a grim enterprise. She persisted and assured him she would stay back so she could not see all that had happened. He relented with significant reservations. Strong emotions can strike without notice, and emotions run roughshod over all judgment. He laid out preconditions and made it known that she must retreat to the tower should they encounter the fiend. Under no circumstance was she to remain or intervene should it come after them. He would deal with it as best he could, while she made haste to the tower. With arrangements made and a simple spade in hand, they made their way out of the tower. He left the door slightly ajar to ensure she could enter the tower, and he then traced a similar path through the woods back toward the windmill. Once there, he surveyed the town from the edge of the woods rather than ascend the hill for fear of being too easily spotted from afar. He was tense and uneasy about the matter, but understood how this might provide some closure and comfort for Lilium. It had not been on his list of priorities. Despite this, he was trying to empathize. She needed this. Surely after 2 days, the creature has moved on to somewhere else, he reasoned. With a measured gait and gaze, he made his way out of the woods with her following behind. They eased to the outer buildings of the town and scanned around corners until they worked their way to the town center. The carnage lay before them. Both horse-drawn wagons used by Lilium's family remained, but one was pulled farther ahead of the other. One horse had made a little distance as it tried to flee before being killed. Braynor realized that only portions of Lilium's family remained. As he surveyed the scene from his position of concealment, he observed a man standing at the back of another wagon pulled between 2 huts on the far side of the town square. The man was pushing something through what appeared to be a covered cage, and slobbering and snarling could be heard in the distance. A mahogany bay horse with a white patch above its eyes was tethered to the cart and shifted about anxiously. He immediately recognized what was happening, who the man was, and what had befallen her family. Before he could plan his next step, Lilium was already out in the open, speaking excitedly. Averting her eyes from the carnage, she called out to the man, "Sir, sir, did you trap the beast?" Shouting back at Braynor, she continued, "It's the man, the one I saw that night. Look, he captured the fiend." Lilium was well out of Braynor's reach. He could not seize her back to forcibly silence her. and her words were as the first volley of arrows loosed in battle. It was too late to stop what was in motion. The man turned slowly in her direction while Braenor commanded her to stop and get behind him. The man reached over and unlocked the cage, and he unbolted the iron door. Shouting something and pointing in their direction, the man stepped away from the cage. The very fiend from 2 nights before emerged. Braenor said, "Now you done it, girl. He's no trapper. Damn man is of the Abyss cult and has bound that fiend to himself." He stepped into full view and waved toward the man. "Girl meant nothing. We were just heading back and we will let you tend to your business." "Ah, if it isn't the cowardly, what do they call you these days? Gray Paladin. I didn't think you would step out of that tower. What a pleasant surprise. The Abyss would raise an army to destroy you, and here I have the chance to claim you as my prize, single-handedly." The man's pallid face and squalid clothing reeked an affinity for otherworldly things. Despite this, the crimson robe did lend him a rakish quality. The fiend lurked up to the man's side. The hair on its human-like head was long but matted and clumpy from smatterings of blood. Its wide gaping mouth reached ear to ear and revealed several rows of teeth, and viscous red saliva slowly stretched and, after hanging for a moment, dripped to the ground. Wretched, twisted flesh covered its sinewy frame, though its stomach was full and distended. Long claws extended from each grasping hand and foot. It was hunched over, and its body twitched and trembled excitedly as it rested on its haunches. There were several clusters of orange pustules on its shoulders and back. Braenor said, "See, the thing is, we really weren't looking to interfere with whatever you were up to. We never saw you and are just going to walk on our way and let you be. Right, girl?" Lilium was petrified and did not speak. She looked straight ahead with eyes wide open at the nightmare opposite her and Braenor. Her expression was pale, frozen terror. "Well, this is too good of an opportunity to pass up, Gray Paladin," he said mockingly. "You are so rarely out of that tower, and I'd much prefer being the one to kill the last paladin." The man uttered something unpleasant and unnatural in a strange tongue which caused the fiend to bristle and bellow a hideous gurgling laugh. The cultist and the pox fiend walked across the square toward Braenor and Lilium. Then the fiend began sprinting on all fours. "Right then, Lilium, run to the tower and don't look back. Close the door behind you." Braenor had already unfastened his cloak and threw it in the path of the charging fiend, while simultaneously drawing his dagger from his waist. The fiend could not avoid the cloak, as it had already begun its leap into Braenor. He sidestepped the creature's outstretched clawed hands and drove the dagger home into its right side with his left hand, setting it with a firm twist of his hips and the handle. The creature screeched and hissed as it fell to the ground with the cloak around its head, writhing in pain as it clawed to free itself. Braenor had 2 equal gut-wrenching realizations in the next moment. His dagger had been pulled from his grasp and remained embedded in the fiend, and Lilium was kneeling nearby praying. "Divines, strike down this creature. May it be so," she repeated feverishly. "Girl, go, get back to the tower," Braenor shouted. The fiend was back on its feet and furious. Braenor realized he would have to be on point with every step and move over the next few moments. He needed that dagger back to have a fighting chance. Nothing else nearby looked close to being a suitable weapon. Braenor stepped back and anticipated its next jump. He rolled onto his back and brought his arms up to shield his face and chest as he placed his feet squarely in the fiend's chest mid-air. The creature was launched through the air toward the cultist, who had to dodge the soaring beast. Braenor used his momentum to roll backward into a standing position, and he turned to face his foes with a twist and hands up at the ready. He glanced over his left shoulder, and Lilium was still there praying, hands together and knees on the muddy ground. "Lilium, I said," he shouted before having to focus on his survival again. The fiend was momentarily dazed, but the cultist was upon him. With his twisted dagger, the cultist stabbed repeatedly at Braenor. As Braenor blocked and parried the cultist's attacks, He answered with several punches and a solid knee strike. Braynor briefly controlled the fight. He then realized the fiend was circling him, not for an opportunity to pounce him, but to get to Lilium without interference. The fiend cackled as it bounded toward her. Braynor pushed the cultist hard enough so that he tumbled backward to the ground, and he then sprinted to Lilium and intercepted the pox fiend with a front kick to its unwounded left side. Its path was narrowly diverted to Lilium's left side by no more than an inch, but she did not flinch. Its momentum carried it forward, and it rolled several times. Braynor rushed forward and kicked the creature's stomach before it was back on its feet. It retched and quickly vomited most of an undigested hand, but this did not slow it down. This time, the creature ascended effortlessly into Braynor, sinking its hands onto his shoulders to hold its victim's head in place so it could bite his face or neck. Braynor exclaimed and struggled under the claws digging into his shoulders. He pressed his forearms into the fiend's throat to keep its maw back. Noxious, warm smells and bits of flesh flung from its slobbering rows of snapping teeth. With careful timing, Braynor placed his right hand against the fiend's throat while using his right elbow to drive the creature's left arm upward. At this exact moment, he shifted his weight, stepped back, and pulling the fiend off balance while twisting his hips, threw it off him. Braynor winced as its claws tore free with it. He then saw the cultist nearing out of the corner of his eye. Braynor faced the fiend and quickly repositioned himself between it and the cultist, ensuring his gaze appeared so focused on it that the cultist would believe he had the element of surprise. Braynor counted on the creature jumping to bite and slash him without delay, and he was not disappointed. With impeccable timing, Braynor sidestepped while dropping to the ground and rolled away from the cultist's downward stab and the creature's leaping attack. The cultist's blow struck the air, but the pox fiend latched onto the cultist's throat while tearing at his chest. The cultist fell backward with the fiend still clinging to him. From the ground, the cultist looked at the pox fiend and Braynor with his remaining moments. He did not have enough throat left to mutter a final word. He was gurgling blood. The pox fiend looked at its master with what might pass for regret. It then collapsed dead, having lost its master and source of binding to the world. Braynor felt his shoulders and grimaced. There was less blood than expected, but he must treat those wounds thoroughly. He then checked himself for signs of the orange pus, which would infect him with the pox contagion. He seemed to have avoided that. He was fine. Lilium, he suddenly remembered with anger. He spun around to face her, and she was still kneeling, repeating her prayer over and over. He began to shout at her. "What are you doing? You knew what you were supposed to be doing? You just going to kneel there and pray while all this fighting is going on around you?" His eyes began to lose their focus. Motioning around with his hands and pointing at her in other directions, he continued, "You just going to keep praying when your brothers are dying? They need you. This is not the time for prayer. Get up and help. Fight. Get up and fight." Braynor spun around and reached out with both hands. He then let his hands fall and dropped to his knees. He looked left and right, and then raised his shaking right hand outward as if reaching for someone. "Meliador." He looked to his left and reached out, his voice now trembling. "Vesuvamorian." "Tressian." He looked to his right. "Crescenor." He began rocking back and forth. "No." His speech then became quiet and mumbled as he spoke through tears. "I'm sorry, brothers. I'm sorry. If I had known, forgive me wherever you are. Forgive me." Braynor continued in this manner for some time. During this, Lilium approached his side and wrapped her arms around him as much as her stature would allow. His body trembled, and occasionally would jolt with a renewed heave of crying. She remained there with him, her tears joining his. After Braynor regained his senses and composure, he approached the cultist horse. From a distance, Lilium watched as he held a hand out and seemed to inspect the horse while talking. He then cut it free. The horse snorted and took a step towards Braynor. "No," Braynor shouted at the horse. "Go west. Just go west." The horse neighed and ran westerly. He then tended to Lilium's family. He dug a single large grave and buried what remained. Braynor found it difficult to explain the circumstances in a way that lessened the awful reality of it all, but there is no easy way to tell a girl that most of her family had been consumed by a pox fiend over the course of the last 2 days. Braynor tried his best to say words appropriate for the situation, but he struggled. He was ill-prepared emotionally, and he was spiritually bereft for the task of conducting something resembling a funeral for Lilium's family. Of course, he knew this before ever leaving the tower to do that very thing. He had just hoped that maybe it would all come back to him in the moment. He did make an effort to tell her he was sorry. Lilium spoke quietly and gently once Braynor had finished. Amid tears, she mostly expressed that she was sorry and missed them, but was glad they were resting in the light of the divines in Brighthaven. They walked back to the tower. This time, Braynor did not move along the outskirts of the town. Once inside the tower, Braynor tended his wounds and prepared food for them, but neither felt particularly hungry. They were both drained, and they turned in early for the evening. Part 3. Braynor tossed and turned in his sleep. A shadowy figure emerged and stood before him. The dim light of the surroundings did not illuminate any distinguishing features. Braynor addressed the figure. "I brought your cloak and some clothes. Come back with me, brother." The figure, hoarse and lacking any semblance of vitality, said, "Has it ever bothered you how many orphans there are? And that not even the sisters who care for them are kept safe by the divines?" Braynor said, "This is why they whisper to me. They call me by name," the figure interrupted. Braynor replied, "Do not listen. Come, we will get through this together. Malchrius, they say. And they say you will forsake your name." "Have you?" the figure asked. Braynor hesitated. "That is not your name. We were always outsiders, you and I. When you stop and think about it, 1 foot in other realms. We were just fighting the war on the losing side. No, we can still overcome. It is not over yet. We can rebuild. Come back with me, brother. We must not lose hope," Braynor pleaded. "Hope? That is the last and greatest evil gift of the divines. They created us and blessed us. But what do they give us in our hour of need? We reach out and they fill our hands with it. We eagerly look down with gratitude, but they are empty." The figure looked at his own upturned hands and studied them. "They are empty. Join me. Stay here with me. We could do this together." "Hope is something. This darkness will pass. Do not give in. Come back to Haverstead." Braynor held his hand out for the figure to take. "No. You can't take me alive anyway. The apostate must perish. Remember?" Disembodied voices, like a wind sneaking around the darkness, began chanting mockingly, "Kill, kill, kill the apostate." Braynor looked around for the source, but it was still just the two of them. "It's not too late. Come back with me. You are not beyond redemption. Please, I beg of you." "He is already here. He has always been here. He calls out to me," the figure said. "Who?" Braynor asked. "He who slumbers until the dark choir sings his praises in a place of ice, but his house is not yet ready." Braynor awoke with a startle. He sat up and looked around the dark room. He then heard the latch of the tower door being jostled. It opened, and light flooded the room. A figure entered, but the light was too bright to see who it was. "Do you remember me?" the man's voice boomed. "Who are you?" Braynor shouted back in surprise. I mend the broken. I heal the hurting. I give hope to the downtrodden. I encourage the brother. I am the true sword of the divines. No, 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 Braynor repeated. I am Ildradath. Remember, the light-cloaked figure commanded. Sweating profusely, Braynor awoke and shot to his feet. He put his back against the wall and felt the stonework. He dug his fingernails into the stone and scraped them against it until they hurt. He glanced around the room while his heart beat out of his chest. The room was dark, and the door was shut. After several minutes, he became convinced that he was awake this time and began to relax. He walked over to the hearth and stoked the embers. Later that day, Lilium held the wooden bowl containing her meal in her lap. It was fuller than she expected. Even though she had not eaten much in the last 2 days, she had no appetite. Braynor's insistence that she must eat something prevailed. She was too exhausted to say no, and her mind was numb. The twice reheated stew waited patiently inside her bowl. She had long since stopped trying to understand how he could return from that barren kitchen with food. Some have been known to experience a peculiar malady, a melancholy of the spirit and digestion. So she was. Her heart was lost in a sea of dark thoughts, and her mind was straining for some glimmer of hope, some vessel that might draw near and rescue her. The rescue she sought was life restored to those she loved and to return to the way things were before, but this was impossible. Her thoughts wandered between such futile longings and accepting things as they were. In abject misery, she swirled the wooden spoon in the bowl and stirred its contents to see what things hid beneath. The first thing to catch her eye was the potatoes. They were somewhat small and generally square. Some had peels stuck to them, still, others partially so, and others yet none. The potato peels were a rich tan with brown spots all over. Their outside looked rough, but those pieces that had come off exposed a slippery, smooth underside. Once in a while she found a round potato. These were unusual, she thought. Why was this round, unlike the others? It wasn't cut that way. Perhaps the stirring rubbed them so. Maybe these were the most abused potatoes, the ones most often smacked by the spoon and tossed against the inside of the pot when stirred. The carrots were larger than she would have liked. Rather than pleasant, even thinly sliced ones, they were chunky. She discovered more than one piece with a firm center, and she detested those. After all the time spent being heated and reheated, they still resisted. She liked the ones she could squish beneath her spoon. The celery was thankfully small. She did not know what to do with celery. Sometimes she loved it. Sometimes she hated it. She was always told to eat it because it was good for her. She wasn't so sure of this, but it was a vegetable. She found celery quite a proud and arrogant vegetable, often too bold and unpleasant for what it actually offered. The onions were a nice touch. The quartered petals of the onions were perhaps too large, but they had a great texture, neither too firm nor too soft. She enjoyed pressing them and seeing if their translucent form would float up and reemerge. The chunks of venison were a saving grace. Although they were not seared in any way, they cooked up nicely. They were remarkably tender and greedy, too. Lilium could press and smush off a piece with her spoon and found that it had indeed held on to as much of the stew seasonings and flavor as it could within itself. She dared a nibble, and it tasted remarkable. Therefore she did not resent venison for its greediness. Perhaps if celery had dared add to its flavor, she would appreciate it more. The broth was quite rich. Its dark brown waters hid more than vegetables and meat. She was curious why she was not more perturbed by the broth. Had it been anywhere but her bowl, it would likely look disgusting. However, it was a marriage bed of the ordinary and the profound in her hand. Occasionally, a tear would fall in, and she found the small ripples a pleasant distraction. In the stew's murky waters, herbs and seasoning floated and sunk like flotsam and jetsam. She wasn't sure which, in any case. She could never remember the difference. Had Braynor intended to use as much as he did? Was everything cast out intentionally, anything unintentionally. In her bowl alone she had a bay leaf, a small sprig of rosemary and thyme, and other blessed seasonings that moved about in the wake of her spoon, swirling and twirling. The soup was hot, and she appreciated the aroma wafting to her nose. The steaminess was encouraging, but she had been tricked many times before. It was meant to entice and fool one into eating too soon before adequately cooled. Many a meal had been ruined by an overeager tongue being scalded by a meal biting back. The bowl was hot in her hands. Its warmth radiated into her arms. The bowl felt well made and had a nice wood grain. It was wonderfully polished, and the spoon was the bowl's equal. Her hands held the bowl with an occasional tremor, originating not from being chilled, but rather a shiver of the soul. She continued swirling her spoon around, straining to believe that some light might soon dawn upon her and provide some insight or comfort to her present distress. She listened to the spoon scrape against the inside of the bowl like it was trying to tell her something. She was not playing with her food. She was delaying as if it might keep the anxiety, sorrow, and terror at bay, but these ancient feelings were adept at clawing their way to the surface. They possessed the power of inevitability in a world facing endless horror. Perhaps in that bowl was a hidden morsel of comfort and hope, if only she persisted in searching long enough. Her emptiness was not from hunger, and she worried that if she ate all of the stew, she would return to where she started. She would not even have the pleasant warmth of the bowl and its possibilities in her hands, but she would still be lost in her sea of despair, something from hidden depths waiting to pull her below. Begrudgingly, she resigned herself and finished the stew, wiping tears that had not fallen into her bowl, and she stared into its emptied chasm as her trembling hands clutched the bowl. The spoon rattled inside. What is hope in the face of the abyss? Part 4. Braynor awoke the following day to see Lilium stoking the fire. She was entranced with the glow of the embers and the soft, small billows of smoke that occasionally rose as she moved them around. "Good morning," Braynor said as he left his pallet and moved to the chair near her. "Hi," she responded. Her eyes did not leave the glow of the embers. She continued poking around while Braynor sat silently. He realized that they were both fine with the silence, and he soon felt bothered by this fact. He began cycling through possible things to talk about, but each one seemed forced and awkward. "I was wondering," she said with a long pause, during which Braynor felt relief that she was breaking the silence. "I was wondering, why do such things exist? Why do such bad things happen?" Braynor grunted. He was surprised by the question, but it was one he might be able to answer. "Well, I can explain some of it, but I'm not sure there is a satisfying answer. You've read the Oracles of Faith." She nodded and turned toward him more. "I know you have heard plenty of stories, and I can see you've been led in the worship of the divines. You have shown you have faith. Unfortunately, over the ages, the true story of our world, of our existence, of our struggle, has been told and retold with inaccuracies. Most are unintentional and arise through ignorance, while others are intentional and for gain or to empower the machinations of the abyss cult. It has been easy to take the oracles of faith out of context, and because of that, I cannot assume that what you have been taught is correct. Moreover, there are some things which have simply not been recorded. Now, consider for a moment the many stories of monsters you've heard. For example, flying serpents that breathe fire, or men who can become wolves or bats and drink blood, are based on certain truths. They are efforts to comprehend the actual monsters that lie beyond comprehension. The real story, the truth, is much more than things that go bump in the night. Nevertheless, from kings to commoners, all like stories of knights in shining armor slaying such things and rescuing the helpless. But these are mostly good political stories that inspire the lowly to trust in their rulers and warriors to protect them. Some stories are told to perpetuate a belief in a system of power, designed to protect the weakest of them, and it inspires boys to grow up and become real fighting men, even though they will most often die with little glory or reward. Such stories also ease the frailties of a ruler's pride and actual power, for they know that men are rarely capable of doing what needs to be done when the real shadows step into the light. Even bad rulers understand that the shadows of this world are great. Regrettably, many have a callous ambition to wield the true power of faith for their own gain. Many years ago, warriors arose who discovered the power of faith in fighting back the forces of the abyss. Some of these warriors, or paladins, began as simple religious advisors to rulers. But paladins are not bought and sold, and do not fight for kingdoms of men, even if they were to serve in their courts. They do not fight for land and tithe, nor title and hold. They fight for what is right and true and good for all people in service to the divines. Their treasure is valor and honor through a life lived by faith. Their tools are not weapons and armor, but their faith. They learn to wield their faith with purity, not Cardathian dynasty building. How I wish paladins were only pawns in the realms of men. That would be a much safer truth for all of us. But they are the mortals who dare wage war against the dark gods, the old ones on behalf of the divines. It is this purpose which united the Paladin Order. Is it still true, Lilium interjected, that the divines cannot fight the old ones themselves due to the Celestial Treaty, so they use paladins? Yes, Braynor responded, but to explain that we must go further back. It is said that before time there were countless ages of nothingness. A primordial confluence arose, which birthed the ancient gods, celestial beings not bound by time or any such limitation as we can conceive. Gradually, personalities and identities arose among them. Eventually, division erupted. Those given to the desire to create and unify became the Godhead, or as we call them now, the Divines. Those who were independent and driven by their whims became the Old Ones. There was turmoil, and it was clear there would be a war among them. But what happens when a god is struck down? Thus, two sides formed. The divines held creation in harmony as the self-evident good, and this was the ideal nature of all existence. After all, they each had arisen, and that was good, was it not? They could use their power and essence to perpetuate this. They were truly one in purpose, favoring compassion and love and creation. The old ones held unfettered will and power as the self-evident good, an only valid foundation of existence. They favored power and control and would not permit themselves to willingly submit to any other or even be considered equals. Eventually, one rose to prominence. Like the others, he has been called different names, but Dread One suffices. He acts as regent among those he has forcefully bowed to his will. A celestial treaty was made between the divines and the old ones. They each arranged separate realms so that they remain eternally separate. They were to never enter the other's realm under any circumstance. But it was also devised that a middle realm, Cardath, should be created in which each could indirectly exert their influence through man to demonstrate the superiority of their respective being. But Lillian once again interjected, shouldn't the old ones be punished for violating this? Is there not some reason the divines do not simply destroy them? Braynor nodded. Yes. The divines' nature is such that they will not and cannot violate their word. To do so would be to invalidate the very nature of their being. They could not be trusted. It would change everything. And if they lost a direct fight with the old ones, it would be unimaginable for mankind. Once the treaty was agreed upon, this bound them. The old ones are not burdened with the violation of their word. It is in their nature to always do as it pleases them. So, Kadath was originally born as a battleground for celestial vindications, in which neither side could take direct action. With the Old One's betrayal, our world and souls have been forced into a perpetual cycle of creation and destruction, life and death. But what are the gifts given to man? Lilium inquired. Brayanor slowly rubbed his palms together and stared into the fire before answering her. You are learned, are you not? Tell me what you remember, beginning from the laying of the foundations. Okay, she replied. It is said, in the beginning the foundations were laid. The great mountain, Kadath, was placed in the sea of the cosmos by the divines. In the unending darkness of its expanse, lights were placed to shine upon its glory. The divines caused the mountain to be shaped, and their laborers formed its peaks and valleys and flat places. The divines then wept for Kadath. They foresaw great tribulations, and the rivers, seas, and oceans were born. All right, that'll wrap that up. So that's a reading straight through of that sample with just a smidge extra there at the end. So I think it's a fantastic book. Obviously, I'm a bit biased. Those who've had the opportunity to read it and give me some feedback, greatly enjoy it. But yeah, so that's the sample. So again, March 25th is when the Kickstarter will roll out and launch. I will have some more videos before then that will discuss and provide some insights to the particular Kickstarter rewards, as well as what Kickstarter is and the purpose for doing this, in case for those of you who are interested in the book but aren't familiar with Kickstarter and why it would be used. So I appreciate your time, your interest, and your support. Best wishes.